The paradox of tolerance. Now, some people cite a footnote from Popper's Open Society, and they argue that they are tolerant of everything except intolerance. It's a popular internet meme. So they present the, quote, paradox of tolerance as the right to be intolerant of the intolerant because, if we're too tolerant, the intolerant will rise to power and there will no longer be a tolerant society. Now, this is the idea behind many hate speech laws. Those who support hate speech laws and the limitations of free speech implied by them, they are simply intolerant of intolerance and hate. Now, let's explore 3 limits of this paradox of tolerance argument and 1 serious criticism of it. The devil is always in the details, so let's start with an example. The Nazis in the 1930s were arguably quite intolerant. So Germany created hate speech legislation, which resulted in the arrest of Hitler, many other Nazis, and the shutting down of some Nazi newspapers. According to the paradox of tolerance, you could argue that these hate speech laws against the Nazis, that they were good because they were simply intolerant of Nazi intolerance. These laws were intended to protect democracy, vulnerable groups, and prevent the intolerant from gaining power. They were intended to get the truth out there. Unfortunately, this hate speech legislation backfired. It created martyrs, brought attention to, and empowered the very ideas the laws were meant to suppress. Now, when the Nazis then gained power later in the 30s, they used this vague hate speech legislation against their opponents. But of course, the Nazis went further because they recognized that to truly censor their ideas, you had to kill the people who embodied those ideas. And ultimately, this is where all censorship leads. To truly censor, the frustrated censors resort to killing the people who embody the ideas they hate. So there are initially 3 limits to the paradox of tolerance. The first limit is hate speech legislation against intolerance often backfires and creates martyrs. It harms the people and ideas the legislation is intended to help. The second limit is those who support hate speech legislation are often hateful and intolerant themselves. They are simply censoring the ideas that they hate. You can study the history of hate speech laws to find many illustrations of that. And the third limit is that those with censorial power eventually recognize that to truly censor, you have to kill the people who embody the intolerant ideas they wish to censor. So those are 3 limits, but there's an even bigger problem with the paradox of tolerance, and it's called the regulator or application problem. So the main problem is who will decide what is and is not tolerant? China is happy to use the paradox of tolerance argument to oppress those, quote, intolerant Muslims and Christians who won't conform to the official values of the Chinese government. Right? In other words, the problem of application, also known as the regulator problem, arises here. Who will determine what is and is not tolerant? The Chinese government? The Republicans in power? The Democrats in power? The Twitter mob? YouTube? Facebook? If the Republicans are given censoring power, they may censor X. Then the Democrats are given the power. They may censor not X. So if the government is given censorial power based on vague and subjective criteria like hate, intolerance, or degradation, then fallible people in government will define those terms as they see fit, and they will censor their enemies. This always happens. In general, because words like hate and intolerance are so subjective and vague, the regulator problem is always in the background of free and hate speech discussions. Who will decide what is and is not hateful or intolerant or degrading? That is the fundamental problem. Who will decide and how? We need some more objective criteria. Now, of course, there will always be laws that are vague and need some judicial interpretation, but we want to limit the vagueness and subjectivity when possible. Otherwise, anything and everything can be rationalized precisely because the law contains highly subjective and vague terms like hate, intolerance, dignity, or degradation. So, for example, right now in 2021, some senators want Facebook to censor, quote, anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim or Islamophobia. They want Facebook to censor that. But who decides what is anti-Islamic? Well, they do, of course. Right? Someone who presents a philosophical argument against Islam or other religions, somebody like Dawkins or Hitchens, they may be considered hateful or bigoted by some Facebook or government censors, just like a person calling for the killing of Muslims on 26th Street. See my case study video for actual examples of this. So the idea is that anti-Islamic bias is too vague and subjective to write into law. So instead of using vague language like hate and intolerant and so on that tyrannical or naive people can use to their advantage, a better approach is to identify a more objective principle by which we can discover which forms of free speech should be restricted. If we don't identify a more objective principle, the people in power, whoever they are, will define or decide what is and is not tolerant, hateful, or degrading. And know that as power shifts, these powerful censors will eventually come for your intolerant ideas and for you. In short, the paradox of tolerance argument collapses when you consider general arguments like these and actual case studies, which I'll do in a few videos. So What is this objective criteria? Well, over the last 100 years, the objective criteria can be found in U.S. Supreme Court cases. It's been clarified there. It's been made much more objective than hate speech legislation. And it's also based on the writings of the philosopher John Stuart Mill. Okay? And so we want to look next at the harm principle, a more objective way to limit